largest think tank outside Washington, D.C. More important than thinking and tanking is that when we look at the Texas public square and the American public square, unlike some research organizations that do very fine academic work, we actually want to do something about the problems we've identified and propose some solutions. And we do so in the name of liberty and in the name of limited government, in the name of free enterprise, all for a much more noble purpose, and that's human flourishing. And I think what you're going to see in today's conversation by both of these scholars is a very thoughtful dialogue about how we can arrive at that goal concerning gun policy. If you think about how fractured the American electorate is right now on what we do about the problems facing us, namely mass murders and mental health and broken family units, I think that we can all agree that we would like to put an end to the specter of us gathering in any setting and being worried about not walking out of there alive. And unfortunately, there's no hyperbole there. You know that we're a center-right think tank. We're unabashedly conservative, and unabashedly because we know that at the root of conservatism is a love for one another, and it starts with building strong families and strong communities and smart policy. Some of you in the audience may not call yourselves conservatives. In fact, you may call yourself a liberal or a progressive and disagree with where this foundation is ultimately going to land on its new policy on the Second Amendment. That's fine. What we want to do today is to lay the foundation for thoughtful research. You're going to see that personified by these two scholars. And we also want to lay the groundwork for a conversation with you afterwards that's civil. And as I like to say, civil discourse does not require unanimity of opinion. In fact, the lack of that is a sign that perhaps we can be civil. So that's a long-winded way of saying thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of this conversation. And to sort of connect the dots about being a think tank, but doing more than that, we're getting into this work not because we don't have some other things to do. You know us to be focused on things like education reform and smart taxation policy, but you also know that when we have been presented with a problem that needs some attention, we are not at all bashful about standing in the breach. And so in Washington, D.C. last year, when it was apparent that we needed thoughtful, conservative ideas about immigration reform from a Texas perspective, we stood in that breach, and we're doing that now. It's very obvious to us because of the work we do, 80% of what we do is focused on the Texas legislature, that we need to stand in the breach and bring some research and some thoughtfulness and some solutions to a problem that, regardless of our political ideology and who we may be voting for this year, keeping in mind we don't do campaigns and elections, we're just focused on ideas and policies, that at least we can have a conversation and we might be able to persuade many in Texas, if not a majority, of our way of thinking. And so that's the framing for our conversation today. And I also, before I introduce our two scholars, I think it's important to keep in mind the historical context for the conversation that we're having. As a historian, I not only don't use hyperbole, or try not to, I despise it. And so when I read these historical documents to you, my desire is not to whip up some political fervor, but to present to you a contrast. And that's a contrast between the United States in the 1780s and the United States in 2020, in particular in the discourse we use to talk about what is a fundamental right, not because we're Americans, not because we're Texans, but because we're human beings on the planet Earth. This is what George Mason, great founder in Virginia, said at the Virginia Constitutional Convention in 1788. The best and most effectual way to enslave the people is to disarm them. Richard Henry Lee, his counterpart or colleague at the same event, said, to preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of people always possess arms. Contrast that with what happened just yesterday in the state of Virginia, where the state Senate committee advanced a number of gun control measures, which at the very least need more research, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And consider, and again, no hyperbole there, I'm just using the words that people decide to use, Virginia Congressman who said that the governor of Virginia might have to call out the National Guard to enforce those measures if they become law. This can make very reasonable people, very rational people, very calm people anxious about what is a natural right. And you see, even for those of us who own multiple guns and like to hunt, as I do, don't see the Second Amendment merely as a constitutional protection for our guns. It's a constitutional protection for us. It's a constitutional protection against tyranny, as these founders said, and unfortunately, as their modern successors in Virginia don't understand. And unfortunately here in Texas, just speaking as a think tank guy, no political statement, former Congressman Beto O'Rourke connected all of those dots for us when in the same conversation, he laid bare the agenda to take away guns as well as to take away some of our other First Amendment rights. That's the framing that we want to talk about today. And doing that for us are two leading scholars in the world of criminology, that's Dr. Derek Cohen, and economics and gun policy, and that's Dr. John Lott. It is a real treat, even if you end up disagreeing with Dr. Cohen and Dr. Lott, to have them here. I work with Derek every day, so at the risk of him coming by later and asking for 3 times his salary for this comment, I will say that he really is a leading figure in criminal justice reform in this country. He would not at all be one to take even partial credit for the First Step Act, which was the culmination of many years of work on criminal justice reform from this foundation. We're not interested in taking credit for that either, but we did play a pretty significant role in it. Derek was at the tip of the spear there. And in addition to that, he brings to these conversations academic quality research and academic quality thought about how we can identify problems and identify solutions. He holds a PhD in criminal justice from the University of Cincinnati and has been published numerous times in scholarly publications. And for those of us who like to pay attention to the real world and not scholarly publications, that's just a slight from one PhD to another. Derek is also very well published in newspapers around the country. We're real privileged to have our friend Dr. John Lott with us. He's an economist, holds a PhD in economics from UCLA. You've probably seen him on different news programs, Fox News, et cetera. Nobel laureate Milton Friedman noted, quote, "John Lott has few equals as a perceptive analyst of controversial public policy issues." And Lord knows this is a controversial public policy issue. John's a prolific author. If you've not read any of his books or have not read some of his recent articles, I think of one in particular in the Wall Street Journal, which contrasted American gun control or gun policy with Mexican gun control policy. I would commend that to you, and please join me in welcoming these two fine gentlemen.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction, Kevin. I'll make sure to only ask for twice the salary then because of the kind words. So we're really glad that everybody could join us here this morning. As Kevin teed up, we are going to be talking about issues regarding the Second Amendment, crime policy, and some of the directions that we see different states and even our own state heading here. Now, Kevin wanted to keep this kind of spicy and have this, be an animating discussion, so I don't know why he allowed 3 PhDs to start on the stage. But we are going to go through kind of like a moderated discussion, and then we're going to go into question and answers, because we want to hear from all y'all, and we want to make sure that we can answer any questions that you have. And the only housekeeping I would introduce then is make sure your question actually has a question mark at the end. That's the curly thing with the dot on the bottom. Everyone has opinions on firearms and firearm policy. We just want to make sure that, better or worse, that we can just get through them all and have that discussion as well. So make sure that when we do get to that question and answers section, that we actually kind of keep it brisk. So without further ado, the gentleman to my left, many of you know as one of the preeminent scholars in firearms research. And to be honest with you, both coming from the academy, I think we can honestly say, Dr. Lott, that that's something that's been largely neglected, not even in just public policy, but criminology. It's been neglected in public health. Actually, we see more writing in public health that tends to promote gun control because under their rubric, public health you can't actually, solve a disease with a firearm. You can't actually alleviate a social ill. Of course, we know differently because you have more nuanced perspectives. But it tends not to be an adequate rubric for actually researching the issues, and that's why we here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation are pushing forward with this particular research agenda. So, Dr. Law, let's take a step back, I guess, to kind of frame this entire discussion in terms that we're having it today. And let's, again, not going all the way back to the 1700s, but let's go back to, the 50s and the 60s. What was the Great American Crime Wave or crime spike? And when did it, when was it, what was it, and when did it kind of subside?
Well, obviously, murder rate kind of peaked in 1991. It fell pretty much until you got to about 2000 or so, and then it's kind of gradually gone down since then. Murder rates started going up in the mid-1960s. Violent crime generally over that period of time. I did want to say, to me, there's a huge amount of research that's been done on guns and crime. I don't know if I can show you. I was going to go and show some graphs on this stuff. But, to me, a lot of the debate, you can explain changes in people's views over time pretty simply on the gun issue. So here's Gallup, and you can see this is from the early 1990s through now. Support for gun control kind of peaked around 1998, 1999. It fell until you got to about 2011. Then gradually it's been going up since then. And I think you can explain maybe about 80% or so of the variation that you see over time in this. And you see other surveys, Pew, CNN, Gallup, all pretty much show very similar pattern. You can pretty much explain most of this just by looking at a few simple questions, such as whether people think guns make them safer or not. Here's just one simple example. Question, do guns make homes safer? And you can see the blue line are people who saying it makes it safer. This is from 2000 to 2014. There was a huge increase from like 35% up to 63%. It's gone down since then from 63% down to 52%. The question is, why do you see that change over time? And I think the next people are talking about how much research is done, and Derek mentioned public health. Michael Bloomberg funded a study basically claiming that research on firearms fell off dramatically after we had something called the Dickey Amendment that was added to the budget in 1996, which basically said that the Centers for Disease Control couldn't use federal money to go and lobby for gun control. And this is the type of graph that he would show people, showing this huge drop from the mid-1990s. The problem was, what he was really measuring there was the percentage of medical journal research on firearms, not the total amount. And the reason why it's falling is not that the research on firearms was falling, it's that you had whole new areas of medicine springing up where you had massive increases in research. So it only fell as a percentage. And you can see here's a graph that shows pages published in medical journals on firearms research. And you can see it was fairly flat after the 96 funding restrictions. Starting in about 1911, you see this huge increase in public health journal research. Is basically within like 5 years, there's a 500% increase. And I think basically what happened was Bloomberg's a lot smarter than a lot of people may think. He realized that he couldn't win the gun control debate simply by going out and doing a normal political battle. He had to go and try to change people's underlying views about guns. And so he's literally spent hundreds of millions of dollars, he and Soros and others, on funding public health research, because they know when they get these things published, they'll get anything from 8 articles to hundreds of articles to 1,000 news articles around the country going and making the claim that basically that guns are bad. And that's really why, when you saw this earlier graph, why I think there's this drop that occurred. Basically, it coincides with the huge increase in the amount of studies that they were funding. And you can see, I'll skip this right here. Just give you an idea how gun ownership has changed over the last 20 years or so. This is probably the only hard data we have. This is on the number of concealed carry permits. You can see about 1.3% of adults had a concealed carry permit in 1998. It's about 7.3%. You have 4 states, including Texas, which have over 1 million concealed carry permit holders. I'm just going to skip this for time. If it works, I'll skip it. Okay. But if I could just talk a bit about 2 types of gun control laws, if you don't mind, because I know Derek has kind of written on the background check stuff. To me, I don't make Second Amendment arguments. To me, the issue is what makes people safer or not. And everybody wants to go and try to stop dangerous people from going and getting guns that may harm others. The problem is the current background check system that we have is a mess. You may frequently hear claims that 3.5 million dangerous prohibited people have been stopped from getting guns because of background checks. That's simply false. What they should say is there have been 3.5 million initial denials, and something around 99% of those, we don't know the exact number, are mistakes. You go and you fill out your form to go and buy a gun, the 4473, you put down your name, your social security number, your address, your birth date, your race, your eye color. You think they're using all that information. What they end up using is roughly phonetically similar names and similar birthdays. And that means you're going to have a lot of mistakes. And particularly you have the most mistakes for minorities. People tend to have names similar to others in their racial groups. You have a lot of Vietnamese here in Texas. 40% of Vietnamese have the same last name. Hispanics tend to have names similar to other Hispanics. Blacks tend to have names similar to other blacks. 33% of black males in the United States are legally prohibited from owning a gun because of just felony records alone. Here's the problem. If you're going to have these types of mistakes, who are these names most likely to be related then to? Let's say a law-abiding, good black male who wants to go and buy a gun to protect himself and his family. There's no reason why they should be having these mistakes. Private companies do criminal background checks on employees all the time. If private companies had an error rate that was 1/100th the error rate that the federal government has, they'd be sued out of existence under federal law. I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to Democrats on Capitol Hill, and I say, maybe we should just have companies look at roughly phonetically similar names when they do criminal background checks on employees. And they'll go nuts. They'll think you're completely crazy because they'll say, well, that would be discriminatory. You'll be more likely to have minorities being prevented from getting jobs. And you say, good point. Maybe, and then you start bringing up background checks for buying a gun, and if they know anything about this stuff, you'll get kind of a deer in the headlights type look. I mean, there's a simple way of solving this. Simply require that the federal government has to meet the same rules for doing a background check as the federal government requires that private companies have to do. Be a simple way to go and solve the problems. The other thing that most people don't appreciate are the costs involved. So in Washington, D.C., where they've been voting on this stuff, it costs $125 to privately transfer a gun. That may not stop Derek or myself from being able to go and buy a gun, but the types of people that my research indicates who benefit the most from owning guns, poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas, $125 might make the difference. I'll give you an example of how they seem to go out of their way to make it costly for people to get guns. Let's say Derek and I lived in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to give Derek 4 guns. I'm just giving it to Derek. You would think that would be one background check. But no, the way they have it set up is there's a separate background check on each gun. For me to give Derek 4 guns, that would be $500 for me to go and do that. There's like no reason other than just making it costly that they go and have the background check separately on each gun that's going to be there. Some years ago, I can give you 20 of these examples. I'll just give you one. Some years ago, I had a call from some state legislators in Colorado when they were passing the background checks on private transfers of guns. And they were asking me what amendments I would put up. And one of the amendments I suggested that they put up was to exempt people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax that they have on transferring guns. Originally it was $25 per gun. Now the new governor's increased it to $75 per gun. And when they put up that amendment, with the exception of 2 pro-gun Democrats in the state house, every other Democrat voted against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay the new state tax. How many taxes can you think of that Democrats will fight tooth and nail against exempting people below the poverty level from having to pay? And okay, I'm an economist, as was mentioned, and I guess I'd make a couple points. One is, if you believe these background checks reduce violent crime, and I'm very skeptical, I know Derek is skeptical of this too, but if you believe it does, you want to encourage people to go out of their way to do these background checks. Do you encourage them by making them have to pay $125 for doing that? Is that going to make it more likely that they're going to go out of their way to do it? You know, as an economist, you may actually say, pay them to do it. But at the very least, you don't want to tax them for going and doing that. The other thing is that if you do believe that it reduces crime, then you believe it reduces crime for everybody, not just the particularly law-abiding person who's going out of their way to go and do the background check. Well, again, as an economist, I would say if you believe everybody benefits, then everybody should pay. You shouldn't put the entire tax, the entire burden on the law-abiding citizen who's going out of their way to go and do the background check that's there. So there's a simple solution to it. If you believe everybody benefits, then pay for it out of general revenue. It's not just the Colorado example. I can't tell you, over the 20 years I've been telling gun control advocates they could get these background checks on private transfers, these so-called universal background checks, passed if they just made a couple simple changes. The first thing that I mentioned, make the government have to make the same regulations for doing background checks that they require private companies to do. The second one is if you believe there are these benefits, pay for it out of general revenue. If you bring that up to a gun control advocate, it's like holding a cross to a vampire. They will fight you tooth and nail against it. And I guess what that's convinced me over time is they really don't want to have the background checks per se. They just want to make it costly in different ways for law-abiding citizens, particularly poor minorities, to be able to go and have guns to protect themselves and their families. I'll just really quickly go through one other law that I know has been topical here in Texas, and that are these red flag laws. And again, everybody wants to stop people who may be a danger to themselves or others from being able to go and obtain a gun. The thing is, you already have laws in Texas and every other state that deal with these issues. Okay, they're referred to by many different names: civil commitments, Baker Act, other things. But if you believe somebody may be a danger to themselves or others, and you go and have them evaluated, 2 mental health care experts, usually in most states, are required. There's a quick hearing. If the person can't afford a lawyer is provided for them. The irony is, when we talk about red flag laws, they're constantly talked about in terms of mental illness. Not one state mental health red flag law requires that mental health care professionals be involved in the process. Red flag laws are overwhelmingly used for concerns about suicide. You would think if you're concerned that somebody may be a danger in terms of committing suicide, you would involve a mental health care professional in the process. one of the reasons why I think that they do push the red flag laws as opposed to make some change for the existing civil commitments is that there are all sorts of civil rights protections that are already in the civil commitment type bills. And I think by having an entirely new bill, they can avoid those. It's a lot more difficult to pull out civil rights protections that are already in an existing law than to start with a clean slate and not include them. And besides, the big loss that impose upon people when they have a red flag law decision against them is the only thing they lose is their gun. Just take an example. From talking to lawyers, it can often cost around $10,000 just to go through a hearing for the red flag law thing. I may want to keep my guns if I'm an individual, but paying $10,000 to be able to do that may not make sense for most people. And when you look at it, very few people who go through the red flag law process actually hire a lawyer to go and help them with that. So anyway, I could go and talk more about these things, but I just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of some of the laws that I know that are being talked about here and some of the issues and kind of the whole debate and how it's changing.
Well, thank you, Dr. Law, for that fulsome summary of some of the discussion that we're having here in the state currently. I want to comment on two of the points that you made and also really underline that last one as well. So you were talking about the CDC earlier. And a lot of people don't understand that because it was, folk wisdom that, the CDC was, quote unquote, prohibited from researching gun violence when obviously that wasn't true. In fact, the Obama administration published several reports that actually tend to argue against the public health scourge, if you will, that they're trying to portray, I would say, firearm ownership as. And so what happened was when they actually banned that funding, what happened was sponsored projects tended to dry up. In other words, universities going to the federal government asking for your money to basically do this research and then use it as advocacy, and a lot of that was going towards advocacy groups. Secondly, on the background check, you mentioned a very good point about indigency. I think a lot of folks don't understand that we have a reading of the Sixth Amendment as an affirmative right. If you do not have a lawyer, you will be given a lawyer. Now, apply that to the same logic to the different situation. Is not the Second Amendment an even more, I would say, a more foundational right that we just simply ask for the right to exist in the negative space of and not be taxed to actually get that background check? But when you said civil commitments, that actually really got me thinking. Civil commitments, let's put it straight up front with the red flag laws. Yes, they will take your firearm, but they do not take your person because they very rarely propose even having an ex parte hearing where they can both seize the firearm and the individual in part of a civil commitment, simply because the burden for the latter is so much higher. And not only that, but you generally see with the civil commitments, that once that person is disarmed, then they're like, oh, well, have a nice day. We'll see you in court or, for your actual in personam hearing. But they don't actually mitigate that, that impending doom this person poses to himself or others.
The civil commitments actually, one extreme is civilly committing the person, but judges have a huge discretion in there. So, many times judges can just take away somebody's firearms, or they can ask the person to get voluntary help that's there, and then they can have a follow-up hearing. There's a whole range of different types of actions that they can go and take. One of the ironies is, if you really believe that somebody is in danger of committing suicide, which is the overwhelming reason that red flag laws are used, is simply taking away their legally owned firearm really a serious solution to the problem? I would argue it's not. If you doubt me, I guess you can go and ask Jeffrey Epstein whether there are other ways for people to go and commit suicide. But, frequently the claim is that guns are the most successful way of committing suicide, and that's simply false. Hanging has about a 90% success rate. Stepping in front of a truck or a train or a bus is about a 96% success rate in terms of committing suicide. Jumping from a height is about a 94% success rate in committing suicide. Taking cyanide is about a 97% success rate quote-unquote success rate for committing suicide. There are lots of ways that people go and commit suicide. I'll just give you one simple fact, and that is we've tried banning guns, handguns, for example, which are the overwhelmingly used for committing suicide in places like D.C. and Chicago. We've had gun bans around the world. I can't find a single place that's banned guns, either all guns or all handguns, and seen a drop in suicide rates. People simply switch into other ways for going and committing suicide. So if you're really concerned about somebody committing suicide, one, why not have mental health care professionals involved? And two, simply saying the only thing I'm going to do is take away your guns doesn't seem like a very useful way. I think it's just that they want to focus only on guns as a way of kind of demonizing them in the debate.
I also understand that having dirt on Hillary Clinton has about a 70% success rate for suicide.
Included because it wasn't as high.
Yeah, that's very well. So, actually, that's a great segue. And well, not that. The thing that you closed out with a great segue into what we're talking. So, you were talking about crime rates in places in which they've enacted these policies. So, one of your most famous works is your book, More Guns, Less Crime. Which is up there in kind of the criminological pantheon of public policy analyses. So can you kind of go into what is the thesis of that book, how you went about the research, and what the general findings are?
Right. Well, I mean, it's a pretty simple point, and that is just you can deter criminals with higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates or longer prison sentences. The fact that a would-be victim might be able to go and defend themselves, at least in theory, can make it riskier for criminals to go and commit crime. And what you find is that there's a lot of evidence that by far the safest course of action for somebody to take when they're confronted by a criminal is to have a gun. My research, if it convinces me of anything, is that police are the single most important factor for reducing crime. But I think the police themselves overwhelmingly understand that while they are very important, they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's occurred. And that raises the question, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And having a gun is by far the safest course of action. And there's two groups of people who tend to benefit the most from owning guns. I would argue that they're the most vulnerable people in our society. The one group are the people who are most likely victims of violent crime. That overwhelmingly tends to be poor blacks who live in high-crime urban areas. The second group of people who benefit the most from owning guns are people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. You're almost always talking about a young male committing the crime, and when a man is attacking a woman, there's a larger strength difference that exists there on average than when a man is attacking another man. And the presence of a gun represents a much bigger relative change for the woman or the elderly person's ability to go and resist the attack.
That's a very good point, especially considering when we take that rationale and apply it in the policing context. One of the I would say research avenues for our senior fellow Randy Peterson here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation is essentially increasing fitness standards, because under the use of force analysis, the objectively reasonable use of force, which we all know is fairly subjective, that differential you talk about comes into play. So a more fit police officer has basically has more of a I would say more of a grounds to try alternative means than would an unfit police officer. Now, folks on the left tend to think that's a great idea in the realm of policing, but that very same rationale does not apply, or they say it does not apply, to individuals in defending themselves. Would you agree?
Right, sure. Well, I mean, I've done some work on police officers and different types of hiring rules that are there, so I mean, I agree with the basic point. If you lower strength requirement standards for police officers, you'll see a whole bunch of things. You'll see more assaults on police. Criminals become more convinced that they are going to be able to successfully escape. So it makes the job of the police also riskier. I don't know how you get around the fact that there are different strengths. Criminals aren't stupid. was chief economist at the U.S. Sentencing Commission. I must have read over 1,000 trial transcripts. And one thing that just hits you that you can't ignore is that criminals are like anybody else. If they can find an easier way to go and commit the crime, to go and get money, they're going to take it. So you'll see a robbery, and they'll have one robber kind of turn state's evidence against the other robber in the trial. And the prosecutor will ask, well, why did you pick this particular victim? And they'll say something like, well, we knew the drug dealer had a lot of money. We thought about that, but, they had a lot of guns, a lot of people. That didn't really make sense. And then they'll say, we talked about robbing a cab driver, but a lot of those are armed. And then they'll say, we saw this relatively small woman walking across an alley or a parking lot late at night, and she looked like an easy target to go after. And so, it's pretty clear that these people take these things into account. I'll give you one other example, and that is there's something called hot burglaries. These are burglaries that occur while the residents are in the dwelling. And we have data across different countries. So like the hot burglary rate in the United States is about 13%. In a country like the UK, for example, it's almost 60%. There are also surveys that are done of burglars in different countries. RAND here has done surveys of burglars who are in prison. And they'll ask them questions about how long do you spend casing a dwelling before you break in? American burglars spend about twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. When they're asked why do they spend the amount of time that they do, the number one reason they give is they're worried about being shot. And so by going and making sure nobody's in the home before they break in, they can avoid that happening. But British burglars aren't worried about that. So 60%, not only does Britain have twice the burglary rate that we have, but 60% of the time when a burglary occurs, the people are at home when the burglar breaks in because they're not worried about what the person in the home there is going to be able to do to them. So they don't bother spending the same amount of time casing a home before they break in.
Well, that actually brings us to an interesting point on the defensive use of guns. I know you've written extensively on it. Gary Kleck has written extensively on it. What are some of the methodological... Well, let me just ask you something up front. How many do we think defensive gun uses there are each year? And how do those numbers tend to get skewed for those who say that, oh, well, it's nowhere near as prevalent?
Well, the only way we really have an idea about this solidly is by looking at surveys. I guess I usually don't put a lot of weight on surveys. There are two different types of surveys that are done. One type of survey that's done across a lot of different groups basically will show that there's between about 1.3 million and maybe 3 million defensive gun uses a year. And then there's the survey done by the National Crime Victimization Survey done by the Department of Justice, which will show that something around 100,000, 125,000 defensive gun uses a year. The difference between those two types of surveys and the numbers is really pretty simple to explain. It has to do with what they call a screening question. The screening question that's used for the Department of Justice asks people, have you been a victim of a crime, violent crime, before they then go and ask how the person responds to it. The type of screening question that's used for the other surveys will ask, have you been threatened or have you been with somebody who's been a victim of a violent crime? And the reason why you get a huge difference in these things, I believe, is that a lot of people who may use a gun defensively, and if their surveys indicate that maybe about 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to cause a criminal to go and break off an attack. That in that situation, you never become a victim of a crime. And so when people are asked, have you been a victim, they never get on to the other questions there because they're screened out of the survey at that point. And I personally, rather than looking at the survey data, I am more into looking at what happens to crime rates and things like that. But, there's reasons why the surveys are used. So I'll give you one example. How do we know the rate that people report rapes, for example? The claim is about half of rapes are reported to police. Well, how do we know it's only half? Well, we know the number of rapes that are reported to police. In order to try to get an idea of how many rapes there are, they go and use a survey, basically, in order to figure that out. And then you divide one into the other. Well, it's the same motivation there. So they can go, we know only about half of gun crimes may be reported to police. Well, the way we guess that is that we know how many are reported, and then we use survey data from the National Crime Victimization Survey to get an idea how many gun crimes there are. If you use the survey stuff and you compare the number of defensive gun uses to the number of gun crimes, it's about 5 times more frequently that people use guns defensively to stop crimes than guns are used in the commission of crimes.
So let's turn our eyes to the national scene right now, because we do see a lot of discussion on the campaign trail as one party is wrapping up their primary. Even just last night, we heard one of the candidates say that 175 million people, 150 million people have been killed by guns. That's more than I would say that's probably more than the Kavanaugh confirmation and the net neutrality combined. Obviously, Vice President Biden misspoke, but I think it kind of generally underlies this kind of misunderstanding of, that's the scope of gun crime and defensive gun use, and this general innumeracy when it comes to this issue, almost selectively. And, obviously, one particular party has it as a cause célèbre to be for gun control. Do you think, and then this is with your speculative hat on, do you think that there's going to be any traction federally on curtailing at least the extant reading of the Second Amendment? And do you have any worries that might trickle down to the states?
Well, I think the answer depends on what's going to happen with the election coming up. And, I think if Trump wins, you're going to have one outcome, and depending who controls the Senate and the House. I'll just give you one example. My understanding right before the impeachment stuff came up was that President Trump was about ready to introduce a proposal to deal with these universal background checks. And it actually was going to be a pretty good proposal that he was going to make. So I've mentioned some of the problems that you have with the false positives. He was going to change that. He was going to basically require that the federal government have to meet the same standards. With regard to the costs, one of the things that he was going to do is set it up so that an app was going to be you could use on your phones. You'd have to have a notary republic because you just don't want me finding out about Derek's past criminal history just by plugging in his name.
Who told you?
Yeah, well, you've kept it pretty safe for a long time. I'm impressed.
I do a lot of work on background checks.
But so I just can't go and enter in other people's names. You'd have to have a notary identify the individual, and then they would put it in. You'd have to pay the notary $10, but that's a lot less than the cost that you have to pay right now for doing these background checks. The other thing is also, you have big rural areas in Texas. You may not have a licensed firearm dealer maybe within 40 minutes of where you live. But if I have my phone and my app, then I can go and do the transfer there rather than have to go and go all the way into where I can get an FFL to do it. My guess is if Trump had done this, the gun control people would have gone completely nuts, even though he would be having something that would require a background check on the private transfers. One thing I didn't mention is I think one of the reasons why they really want the universal background checks has nothing to do with crime. It's a way of setting up a registration system. So let's say I go and I have background checks on all sales and all private transfers. At the end of 5 years, I would know all people who had legally obtained a gun over that previous 5-year period of time. And you could have some future president or some future Congress who could go and say, you know, all those records that you've been collecting, we want you to, they're probably digitized anyway, send them into the federal government, and then you have kind of an instant national registration list. One of the things about using this app, which I'm sure would have driven people absolutely nuts on the gun control side, is that the background checks would have been done through the federal NICS system. Rather than through an FFL, who would then use the NICS system. And the reason why that's different is that the federal government, when the NICS system was set up, is required to destroy records on background checks within 24 hours after the background check is completed. And whereas FFLs are basically required to keep the information for perpetuity. And so it would short circuit this ability to go and use the universal background check system to go and create a national registration list there. And but I think the interesting thing would have been if Trump had done this. It basically was taken off the agenda because of impeachment. Trump was basically convinced that these guys weren't willing to really have any serious discussions on the issue. That it would have changed the entire debate and basically forced Democrats to explain what their objections were, why they don't want to have the federal government have to meet the same standards for doing background checks that we require for private companies, or why we shouldn't have the same rules for retaining information for generally what we already have for the federal government.
You make a really good point about the
Just one?
Just one within the last 10 seconds. You made a very good point about the sanctity of the background check system, and it seemed as this basically this complete registry of everyone who has ill intent. And I think that what a lot of people miss on that is the fact that in order to make the, I would say, firearm ownership safer, quote unquote, what a lot of people's policy prescription for that is let's add more names to the list. And it's the same thing we've seen in some of the states with sex offender registries. If you actually have a sex offender registry and it has people who have done, very indecent, very damaging things on there, but then you put in, I would say lower tier offenses such as, public urination, streaking at a football game, things like that, and there's no delineation between the two, it essentially waters down the value of the list. It's the same thing as if everyone's on there, no one's on there. And I think that that's one of the areas that we're getting to with, in NCIC and the NICS system.
Well, the problem that you have is that you have these false positives. And so even if you put good names there, if you don't kind of have some way of making sure, you're having a name that matches. So like, for example, right now, if you have the name Smith with a Y and an E or Smith with an I, as far as the computer system's concerned, it's the same name. I'll just give you one funny story. There's, I'm just drawing a blank, Congressman from California, McClintock. He was on the no-fly list for a number of years when he was a state senator in California. And Tom actually gave this speech on the House floor where he was explaining that he would go to the federal agents and explain that he was being denied being able to fly on planes. And finally, one of them pulled him aside and they said, look, what you do is, rather than going on reserving the tickets as Thomas C. McClintock, go and just use your middle name and have T for your first one. And he did that, and he ended up going through all the time. But I'm sure that gives you a lot of confidence in the background check system. But in case you ever got on the no-fly list, now you know how to avoid it.
Well, let's not be too hasty about denigrating keeping politicians from getting on planes. I think that's we at least need more research on that.
Ted Kennedy ran into the problem because there was a terrorist that the British government had put on somebody with the IRA, and Ted Kennedy was denied like 5 times getting on a plane. But he was able to call up and get it fixed right away.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for bearing with us, and I think that was a very good, productive conversation to kind of set the stage for participation from y'all. And so, what's going to happen now, just to repeat the ground rules, is Clint in the back there is going to walk around and when you're called on and present you with the microphone, just again make sure that it's short with an upward inflection at the end, so that we can answer it and everyone gets an opportunity to weigh in on the discussion.
So as far as I'm aware, there are 4 states that generally allow the public with licenses to carry concealed in K-12 schools. Are you guys aware of? That's not true?
No, there's 20.
Okay. So are you aware of any body of study that looks at the effect of such laws?
Well, we've done that. I mean, the Crime Prevention Research Center, we went through and looked at all discharges of guns on all schools in the United States from 2000 through the end of 2018. Anything from an accidental discharge where nobody shot all the way up through mass public shootings. And what we found was that so you have 20 states that have teachers that carry guns. I mean, it varies a lot across those states in terms of the extent. I mean, you have states like Utah and New Hampshire where if a teacher has a gun, they can just go and carry. Texas has something like about 37% or so of school districts have teachers carrying guns. Oklahoma, Ohio are similar rates. And so it varies. You know, some states you may only have a dozen school districts or a few that do it. But what we found is that there was no attack of any type at any of the schools that had teachers carrying guns. There was nobody who was shot or injured or killed at any of the schools that have teachers that have carry guns. So there's some questions that are incredibly easy to answer, and that is the big concern that you have with teachers carrying guns is that, well, they'll lose control, some student will get a hold of the gun and use it improperly, or the teacher will accidentally fire the gun and wound somebody. Those just don't happen. There's not one single case where students obtain control of a teacher's gun. There is one accidental discharge that occurred, but nobody was shot. It was at a school in Utah in 2014 after school hours. A teacher had gone into the bathroom and she fatally shot the toilet. But beyond that, that's the only one. You know, and Utah has had teachers carrying guns for 20 years. The best estimate from the concealed handgun board there is that you have something like around 6% of teachers in the state carry concealed handguns regularly, and you have about 10% of the support staff in Utah schools regularly carry.
Yeah, John, what would a bill look like that would effectively use a mental health professional in this red flag issue?
Well, you just do what you have with the civil commitments. You have something where somebody has to be evaluated. Different states have different rules on the time frame that's involved. Some require the evaluation has to be done within 24 hours. Others may be 72 hours. And then you have a hearing where the experts will come in and talk to the judge, but you'll be represented by counsel there if you can't afford one. One of the things I'll just mention is that these red flag laws can actually accomplish the opposite of what you'd like to have accomplished. I'll give you 2 examples. One is I have a very close friend of mine whose husband was murdered in front of her by one of her stalkers. And, it was in a gun-free zone, but that's beside the point for this discussion. as anybody in that situation, she was incredibly depressed after this stalker had murdered her husband. And what had happened was, let's say you had had a red flag law in effect there. Think of the impact that that might have had on her talking to other people. You have well-meaning people who, a friend or a neighbor or relative who would say, she has a gun, she's extremely depressed, I'm worried about her, maybe we should take away the gun just to try to be careful there. Well, the problem is, the last thing she wanted to have is be disarmed. I mean, she just had a stalker murder her husband in front of her. And the impact that could have is that may make her afraid to go and talk to other people. Take police officers. Police officers are depressed at higher rates than the general population. They commit suicide at higher rates than the general population. But you take away a police officer's gun and you've essentially taken away their job. What impact would that have on their willingness to go and talk to other people about their depression that's there, even well-meaning people that's there? One of the things that you have with the civil commitment type law is, let's say my friend had, you had a civil commitment type procedure against her. She could at least explain then to the mental health care professional what her concerns are and why it's important to her to be able to go and keep her gun. And then the mental health care professional can evaluate the trade-offs that are there. The problem that you have with red flag laws is the only thing that the judge sees in front of them when they make the initial decision to take away a person's gun is just the written complaint, okay? And that written complaint could be, again, somebody who's very well-meaning, who just is for their own, concern for her safety are acting that way. But she's not able to go and make the counter arguments to the judge. It may be a month later, depending upon the state, before she would have a chance to go before the judge and make that point to the judge there. But, you may end up making it so people benefit a lot from being able to go and talk to others when they're depressed. Do we really want to be in a situation where people are afraid to do that? The irony is that liberals understand this in other areas. Take something like AIDS. You may remember when AIDS first came out, there was a lot of discussion about should we have public lists of people who have AIDS, all right? And one of the reasons for having a public list was to try to reduce the spread of AIDS there. But the response that Democrats and others would bring up is, well, you can't do that because if you do that, you'll discourage people from getting tested and treated. So they understood it in that respect there. I think the reason why they don't at least appreciate it here is now we're talking about guns, and they don't attach the same type of concerns or feelings with regard to them.
Have you observed a difference in offense rates with states which have licenses that are more restrictive than other states? And also, have you observed a significant difference in offense rates in states which allow unlicensed carry versus those which require a license?
Right. Well, I'll just say with the constitutional carry, we have 17 states now, which are all or virtually all the state. Doesn't require you to have a license to be able to go and carry. Most of those states are just in the last few years, so it's kind of too early to be able to really do a lot with it. I mean, I've looked at some of the earlier stuff, but from the way I look at things, you really need data before and after a change. So Vermont's had it since the beginning, so we can't really learn much from that. You have states like Arizona and Alaska, which have had it since the early 2000s. But there's not a lot of changes up until recently to do that. But your other point, I think, is important, and that is you see huge differences across states in terms of concealed carry laws. I'll just give you a simple example. Compare Indiana to Illinois. In Indiana, about 18% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. In Illinois, it's just over 2%. Why the huge difference between those two states that are next to each other? Well, it's actually very simple to explain it, and that is, what's the cost of getting a concealed carry permit? Indiana, up until last April, the total cost for getting a concealed carry permit was $50. Now it's $0. So my guess is the numbers have gone up even more since then. But in Illinois, it costs at least $400 to go through the process to get a concealed carry permit. When you talk about the $150 fee for the permit plus 16 hours of training. Plus, it's kind of like, because Illinois was forced to have a concealed carry law because of a court decision that was there. And it's kind of like they went through everything they could to make it difficult. So if there's no training facilities in Chicago. If you're a poor person, you have to travel outside the city. You can't take a permanent concealed handgun on public transportation. So basically, poor blacks who live in Chicago, they have to go and borrow a car from somebody if they don't already own a car and travel way outside the city for 2 separate days at least to go and get the training. Well, it's not too surprising. You make it difficult and costly. You have a lot fewer people to do it. Now you're beginning your question to ask the impact on crime rates. And it's important for the licensing rules that you're bringing up for 2 reasons. One is, I would argue that the risk that the criminal faces for going and attacking somebody is related to the probability that they can defend themselves. Well, if it's only 2% of the population, adults in Illinois, that have a concealed carry permit, that's a lot lower risk for the criminal than in Indiana, where it's 18% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. But it's more than that. It also changes the composition of people who go and get permits. In Illinois, it's basically wealthy white males who live in the suburbs are the ones who go and get a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, you see a lot more poor people, a lot more minorities getting concealed carry permits. Now, why is that important? Well, the reason why it's important is it's just not the percent of people generally who carry concealed, but it's whether or not the people who are most likely victims of violent crime are carrying concealed. And so if you have poor minorities who live in high crime urban areas are the ones who now can afford a permit. So this $450, that's just the cost of the permit. It's not the cost of the gun or anything else that's there. So you expect to see a lot bigger impact on crime rates in Indiana than you're going to see in Illinois. Texas, for example. You go back a decade ago, and Texas's number of people with concealed carry permits had kind of plateaued at about 500,000. And it's like 1.4 million. And the reason why it's increased so much has basically been because of 2 major changes that Texas had in its concealed carry laws. The first change was it reduced the training requirement. It used to be 10 hours to get a permit and 10 hours for renewal. Now it's 4 to 6 hours to go and get the permit to begin with, and no mandated training for renewal. That had the first big increase in the number of people going and getting concealed carry permits. And then more recently, you've lowered the permit fee from $140 down to $40. And you can see for some of the data where you have zip codes for people who go and get concealed carry permits that now you're getting more people in more minority areas in poorer, lower income areas getting concealed carry permits than you were able to go and get before. I hope that answers your question.
In hindsight, it seems like civil commitment ought to have actually stopped some of the mass murders we've seen. I'm thinking like Newtown or Stoneman and Douglas. Is hindsight wrong, or do we have a sense of why civil commitment doesn't work in those cases?
Well, I'll say this, and that is mental health care experts, it's kind of more of an art than a science in many ways. And would I still like to have them involved in the process? Yeah. But about half the mass public shooters over the last 20 years or so, we're actually seeing mental health care professionals relatively close in time, like within 6 months of when they did the attack. And yet the amazing thing is that in not one single case did any of those mental health care professionals identify the person as a danger to themselves or others. In fact, there's a whole academic literature out there about their inability to identify people who are violent like this. And they explain it for lots of reasons. So one of the major things that you see in this academic literature is just the really tiny rate that you see people engaging in this type of violence. So you say something like schizophrenia. There are probably about 2.5 million people in the United States, roughly, that have schizophrenia. If you look over since 1998, there's an argument may be made, 2 of the mass public shooters were suffering from schizophrenia to some degree. And so, you know, if I were to go and just tell you, and this is the type of example they'll have in the literature, is you got 2.5 million people. Pick the 1,000 people that you think are the most likely to engage in this type of violence of these 2.5 million people with schizophrenia. Even if the one person that you could get, you know, who would do this would be in that 1,000, you'd still be wrong 999 out of that 1,000 times that were there. And so, you know, and the thing is, just generally, you have to understand is that people with mental illness, one, tend to be less violent than the general population, and they also tend to be more likely victims of violent crime than the general population is. And so the notion of disarming them, and also the notion of just kind of false positives that are there, they're much, you know, the rate that you're going to be making errors is pretty huge.
And I'd like to just add on that is that, you know, in dealing with the mental health community, you know, we've talked to many people in the LMHAs, the local mental health authorities, and they, to be honest with you, from a practical standpoint, and this is understandable, want very little to nothing to do with this. Not because they are shirking a civic duty or anything of the sort, but because they're worried about professional liability. They're worried about, you know, again, like Dr. Lott said, they're worried about the outcomes of false positives or just an ever-widening net. You know, just like, seems like everybody these days has ADHD and peanut allergies. When we widen the definition of a particular social concept, we tend to actually rope in as a larger percentage of the people. So that's something to keep in mind in this particular case. And also, I want to draw an underline under something else Dr. Lott said. Mental illness is not monolithic, and you know, we definitely see individuals with mental illness who do engage in violence. But as you said, it's such a rare occurrence that one of the issues that the mental health community has is they're worried about over-stigmatizing based on kind of a layperson's understanding of mental health. And so we're getting kind of down on time, but I think we can get one, maybe 2 more questions.
I have sort of 2 smallish questions that are both about the background check app you were talking about. The first one was, I hadn't really heard of that before. Is there a particular bill, or was this a program that the president was putting forward?
That the White House was going to unveil. The whole impeachment move occurred right before they were going to do it.
So this would have been like November, December they were talking about
remember,
it?
But it would, yeah, probably.
Okay.
No, it would have been before December. It would have been, I don't know, it would have been like October, end of October,
Okay.
something like that.
Just so I can go back and look it up.
Well, no, but it didn't, I mean, I'm telling you just because I know people what was going on. I'm not saying that this was something that I don't know if you're going to
So
find
it wasn't an
user.
actual proposal or anything?
Well, it was
This
a
just
proposal within the
scuttlebutt?
administration, but it just didn't get to see the light of day.
Okay. And then I had a question about, you brought up, you know, with the app, obviously something that makes getting a background check easier and more accurate would be beneficial. But you brought up the fact that like a FFL has to keep the information, keep the applications for the background check, whereas the federal government does not. They are mandated to destroy it after 24 hours. So if we start using the app, speaking as somebody who really relies on the data and is using the data to talk about what makes people safer, do you have any kind of proposal or idea about how we would be able to maintain that data, not
What data?
as a registry? Well, if we're talking about, you spoke at length about background checks and how, there's that quoted 3.5 million people have been prevented, which isn't really true, right? It's 3.5 million checks have been rejected. It could be different people, it could be mistakes, as you say. If we're actually trying to solve a problem, data is helpful.
Well, we already have
So-
a huge amount of data. So, for example, the debate I always get into with gun control advocates then is, we need registration, okay? We have a de facto registration right now with the FFLs, okay? But the thing is, you can go and look at places in the United States or even around the world that have registration. Hawaii's had registration licensing of guns since 1960. Washington, D.C. has it. Chicago has licensing and registration of guns. And one of the things that's amazing, so I testified before the Hawaii legislature a few years ago, and I told the people that were inviting me, I said, look, the Honolulu police chief's going to be testifying on the other side. There are two questions. Tell them in advance. You're not trying to sandbag them. Tell them two questions you're going to ask them. The first question is, how many crimes can he show that they solved as a result of licensing and registration? And the second question is, how much does it cost each year to go and run the program? So he researched it, came in there, and he was asked, and he said he could not find a single crime that they'd been able to solve as a result of licensing and registration. And then they asked, well, how much does this cost? And he said, well, he didn't have a dollar amount, but he estimated it took about 50,000 hours worth of police time each year to go and run the program. Now, if you could go and say you've solved thousands of crimes, okay, or hundreds, or at least a dozen or something like that, then because we know 50,000 hours of police time is like a lot of police time that you can do real policing that we know works, okay? And so we're giving that up in order to do the registration. And it's just not the United States. You have countries around the world. I mean, the same thing in D.C. and Chicago. Pennsylvania has had basically registration and licensing of handguns since 1934. No, but that's what it's, but the thing is, you can go and see already with that data, because it's basically a background check done, and then we have a piece of paper that's. No, but Pennsylvania's not a trivial state, and they've had it since 1934, and for handguns. And Canada has had it for handguns since 1934, and they had it for long guns starting in the late 90s, I'm sorry. And, the Canadian police couldn't identify one single crime that they've been able to solve as a result of registration there. Same with the Pennsylvania police and others. So, I mean, it's not, I like data too, and I like having the fact that different places have experimented with these types of things. But we have a lot of data already out there. And we've had background checks now since 1994.
Well, we're actually getting the hook, unfortunately. Maybe that chime was us getting run off the stage. Really glad everyone was able to make it out this morning. Before we leave, one last round of applause for our guests, please.